Afternoon. Welcome to this webinar with Professor Paul Prinsloo for Emerge Africa. Paul is going to speak a bit about learning analytics, and we're very pleased to have thorough view and very authoritative view on the topic. So just to briefly introduce our speaker, Professor Paul Prinsloo is with the University of South Africa, known as Unisa here in South Africa. He's a research professor in open and distance learning at the College of Economic and Management Sciences. And his academic background includes fields as diverse as theology, art history, business management, online learning, and religious studies. And Paul has published recently quite widely on exactly on learning analytics and curriculum developments. So we are very excited to draw on his expertise and also put learning analytics into the context that we are in, namely the African context. All right.
Great, thanks Jacob, and thanks for everyone for having me here. I hope what I will share with you today will trigger thoughts. I don't have the answers. I think after preparing this presentation, I have more questions than answers, but maybe that's a good place to start. So I just want to acknowledge that in this presentation, I don't own the copyright of any of the images, and I've published this presentation this morning on SlideShare on LinkedIn, and you're welcome to download it and reuse it, and there you have the licensing agreements. I also have a bit of a confession. Normally my PowerPoints, and Sharon can attest to that, are very visual, and I love to make use of visuals to sort of add to the meanings. But I decided to go a bit text heavy in this presentation, so please forgive me. And please don't use this PowerPoint as an example of what a PowerPoint should look like. The reason for the amount of text in this presentation is just to allow this presentation to stand on its own as a possible resource, or whoever may find the content or part of the content usable and informative. So in preparation for this meeting, the organizers asked me to respond to the following questions. Is bigger data better data? What evidence can such data provide, and what are some of the shortcomings? And I see, Ian, that you were specifically interested in the big data part. I hope I addressed that. What are some of the ethical dilemmas involved in uses of student data? And we're very lucky to have Sharon Slade of the Open University in the room. And they were the first university that we know of that developed a ethics policy on the use of student data. So if I don't know the answers, Sharon may be able to share her experiences. The third question was, is the hype over learning analytics based on idealism rather than reality? How can we move beyond the hype of learning analytics? And I'm not sure about that, whether we will ever get behind the hype. But the fourth question was the one that interested me the most. Are lessons learned from the global north about users of learning analytics a useful starting point for educators in African higher education? What do we adopt and where do we adapt? And I think this is, of all the questions, this fourth one fascinates me and exposes some of the dilemmas, but also some of the unique opportunities for learning analytics in the global south developing world context. And I realize the terms global south and developing world, these terms are contested and contestable and should be contested, but just accept it for now. So considering our locations and histories, plurals, past and present, and specifically from the perspective of the global south, I have a suspicion that we in the global south see data differently, and that we are very aware of how certain variables and characteristics were selected in the past and were used in the past as a basis for dehumanizing many identified individuals and groups, like race, like gender, like culture. So we're very aware, and I'm very aware, increasingly aware of how that there's a possibility that we see data per se differently. We are very aware, I think, of the challenge of dealing with the intergenerational legacy of classification systems where the potential for advancement and access to resources were determined based on assumptions and stereotypes of race, gender, and culture. So because I think in the global south, we're very aware of the structural constraints and the intergenerational legacy of classification system, I think I myself has a sensitivity and possibly a bigger sensitivity than many of my colleagues in the North Atlantic Hemisphere about the effects of what happens when we classify someone as at risk or as having a low potential or whatever. Also, considering our locations and histories, I think we need to ask how learning analytics function in environments where online access and participation are unevenly distributed and where logging, download, and participation data say more of the legacy of apartheid and colonialism than of students' potential motivation and aspirations. I think I've become aware in my contact with other colleagues that in other contexts, logging detail and download and participation data are used and may be proxies for motivation, maybe proxies for potential and aspirations. And I do think in a global south environment, using these type of data as proxy for potential motivation and aspirational is highly contested and should be contested. We often wonder how to engage with the number of logins and downloads and the number and the quality of online engagements where evidence suggests that these numbers correlate with socioeconomic and prior learning circumstances and not per se with student potential, motivation, and aspirations. And please feel free to comment on that, but that's my gut feeling that in the global south, we have a huge sensitivity or a bigger sensitivity for the fact that the number of logins and downloads and online engagement does not really correlate with potential motivation or aspiration due to aspects outside of students' control. Furthermore, I have a suspicion that our geopolitical and institutional context and the inefficiencies in our context, whether it's postal services, whether it's provision of Wi-Fi, whether it's structural constraints, impact more on individual performance than individual students' agency. And I think that's one of my concerns with regard to learning analytics, that learning analytics focus on what students do and not what students do in response to the inefficiencies in institutional and national infrastructure constraints. I have further a suspicion that higher education institutions in the global south often, mostly, lack the resources and infrastructure to establish and maintain integrated systems, processes, and policies to enable appropriate and ethical data collection, analysis, and use. So when we speak about implementing learning analytics in our institutions, we face that we really have a lack of resources and infrastructure constraints. Many, and I wonder whether it's not most of the institutions in the global south, do not have capable and well-resourced human resources, like, for example, data scientists to optimize the potential of learning analytics or have the resources to respond ethically and appropriately to identified needs. Increasingly, I'm aware, and Sharon can attest to that, of the skill set that people need when they engage with student data, whether it's mathematics, whether it's computer science, whether it's human sciences. It's a unique skill set, and we just simply don't seem to have that skill set in our institutions. And this is a very interesting one. I have a suspicion that the gender and race of those who code and develop algorithms may have internalized the assumptions and beliefs of the North Atlantic and perpetuate these assumptions and beliefs through code. This week it was published that Amazon and Google, female coders and white coders, their codes and their algorithms are accepted more than the algorithms and the codes coded or developed by people of another race or gender. So I wonder how the gender and race of those who code and develop algorithms in the global south, how much have we internalized the assumptions and the beliefs of the North Atlantic? and how we perpetuate these assumptions and beliefs through code. And finally, considering our locations and histories, is it possible that African higher education institutions are for sale to the highest bidder, those commercial vendors and apostles of Silicon Valley who regard a free iPad and a dumbed down version of the internet as a fair exchange for access to students' data? Because of these constraints of the previous two slides, I think institutions in Global South are very vulnerable, and we're very keen to adopt learning analytics. And our easiest route to adopting learning analytics is to go for a commercial vendor or external provider. And then I have a serious question. How do we sell our student data, and what happens then? So making sense of the collection, analysis, and use of learning analytics is increasingly like eating a bowl of spaghetti, at least for me, and it's messy, it's not neat, it's not quite successful, and you cannot really engage with the debate on learning analytics without getting your hands dirty. So just an overview of the presentation. I want to just give a short introduction to learning analytics. I want to map some of the social, technical, imaginary of evidence, student data, and the need for more data. I want to engage with the question of how do we engage with the potential, the dangers, challenges in the collection, analysis, and use of data. When? I want to disclose my own position regarding technology. I think that's important. You may have another view. I want to map student data, what data we currently have, what we don't have but can collect, and what data we may never have, and how that impacts on learning analytics. I want to share with you some pointers considering the potential limitations and challenges in learning analytics. I want to ask, what about the ethics of not collecting, analyzing, and using student data? I think we can become obsessed with what are the ethics when we do collect, but what are the ethics when we don't collect, when we don't analyze and use student data? And I hope to provide some in conclusions. So, okay, that's a standard definition. It's maybe known knowledge for many of you, but learning analytics refer to the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about the progress of learners and the context in which learning takes place. So let's work with that definition. For those of you who are interested, this is a recently published report on learning analytics in higher education. Very strong basis in the UK, but very informative and very helpful. It was published in January 2017. There you have the link. More recently, Dragan Gašević presented a seminar on which Inge de Waard wrote a blog, and it's a very informative seminar and blog on how do learning analytics as a practice or as practices inform research and practice. So please have a look there. So if that is our definition, the first that comes to mind is that the emphasis is on learning and informed about our beliefs about what constitutes learning. The second issue is, what do we measure? How do we measure? How often do we measure? When do we measure? What don't we measure? And I think this is enough for another presentation. Then the other issue, where do we collect? What do we collect? How often, for what purpose, and who does the collection? With regard to analysis, some questions. Who analyzes data? What are their skill sets? What are their genders, their profiles, their race, their position, their knowledge of education? What do they use? What tools do they use? What skills are required? And who verifies their analyses? With regard to the context, do we assume that all their learning takes place on the LMS? The learning management system? What do we assume about their logins, their downloads, their clicks? What do we know about their student, the context of our students? How do we find progress? That's an interesting one. How quick must a student do the course, or in what time limits do we impose on completing a course or a program? How do we involve students in making sense of the data, of their progress, of their journeys? And then lastly, just for now, to whom do we report this data and our analyses? And what then? Now that we've reported it to Senate or our structures, once we've reported it to the department or to the tutors, what then? Who will act? What if we cannot act? What if students don't act? So this is an interesting dilemma in which Sharon and I in our latest work reflect is, when we do analyze students' data, do we have an obligation to act, and what happens if we don't? So I would like to problematize it. How do we talk about the collection, analysis, and use of student data in a world that has become saturated with data? And I know saturated with data in the global south is most probably an overstatement, but let's work with this. In a world that has become saturated with data, ranging from automatically collected every time you swipe your card, you use your credit card, you use your phone, analyze and use, purposefully collected, analyze and use, and volunteered on social media in exchange for often perceived benefits despite concerns about privacy and an uncertainty of how the data will be used downstream and combined with other sources of data, and in a context where our trust in the collectors of data is often misplaced, irrational, or wishful thinking. So how do we think about learning analytics in a world like this? This is very recent. This was published, oh, not that recent, in 2014, but I mean, it could have been 2017. How data-driven learning is changing education. And the hype has not stopped since then. Success here derives from access to data, or big data, as it's sometimes called. Data matters. Maryland universities to use data to predict student success or failure. This is more recent. This was in 2016. So we see student data increasingly as the new black, as a resource to be mined, to be scraped, to be abused, to be misused. This is from 2016, Oklahoma University making students wear fitness tracking devices. Holy mother in China, for what? What will we do with this data? How will we combine this data? What does this data mean? University to monitor students' social media to gauge well-being. This is very recent. This was March 2017. What will we do with this data? Do students know that we look at their social media accounts, and how do we gauge well-being, using what criteria, what variables? And what happens if we do know, if we suspect that a student is depressed? Who will do what? So I think increasingly, I do think that student data acts as Medusa, where, if you remember, the Greek myth is where you look at her, and yes, it is a her, but it could have been a him, where with snakes as a hair, and when you look into his or her eyes, you became frozen. So higher education is mesmerized and seduced by the potential of the collection, the analysis, and use of student data. So students increasingly feel under surveillance. This was from 2015. Students worry, and this is recently, this is March 2017. Students worry education technology might predict failure before they have had a chance to succeed. So I think we really need to consider this. So how do we talk about the collection, analysis, and use of student data when we have access to more data, often increasingly real-time, granular, and very personal, of some students, while a lot of our data, about most students, are but proxies for their circumstances? For example, we use their addresses to give us an idea of their socioeconomic income. And we use proxies for their potential prior learning experiences. But in the global south, what does a school leaving certificate mean? What does it say about their potential? So we collect, we measure, we analyze, and use student data in isolation from issues surrounding epistemological access, institutional operational inefficiencies, pedagogical approaches, faculty and support staff inexperience, and disengagement. And I think this is one of the travesties of learning analytics, that we only measure what students do. And what about faculty? What about administration? What about student support? What about management? Where do we hold them account? And current research suggests that most of the variables impacting on students' chances of success, for example, socioeconomic circumstances, political and economic instability, fall outside the locus of control of students, faculty, and institution. So where does this leave learning analytics? We already have a lot of data that is scattered all over the institution in a variety of formats, ranging in quality, collected for a variety of purposes, with and without ethical clearance, and there's the issue there. Accessed by a variety of staff for a variety of purposes and combined with other sources of data collected for other purposes and used for unrelated needs. So how do we address this? There's also this notion that we want to value quantitative data and ignore qualitative data. We celebrate big data and we ignore small data. And we value surface level trends rather than thick descriptions. We are obsessed with what is happening. And we don't seem to understand or ask the question, why is that pattern happening? So students don't know that how we collect, analyze, and use their data, and don't have access to their digital dossiers to question, to verify, to add context, and or to opt out. And then lastly, the effectiveness and appropriateness of our responses to our analysis depend on our own locus of control, our resources, our understanding of the data, and a political will or lack of. How do we collect, analyze, and use student data while recognizing that their data are not indicators of their potential merit or even necessarily engagement? That the results of the intergenerational impact of a skewed allocation of value and resources based on race, gender, and culture. I actually just want to leave that slide there for a while. So how do we use data if the data are proxies not for their potential, but for recognizing the intergenerational impact of a skewed allocation of value and resources based on race, gender, and culture? So let me disclose how I feel about data and technology and education. I just love this by the British philosopher John Gray, where it says science and technology increases human power and magnifies the flaws in human nature. It enables us to live longer and have higher living standards, some of us, than in the past. At the same time, it allows us to wreak destruction on each other and the earth on a larger scale than ever before. And I think this is a leitmotif in this presentation and in my view on data and technology and educational technology. It can be the force for good, but it can be a force of much evil. So if we accept that educational technology needs to be understood as a knot of social, political, economic, and cultural agendas that are riddled with complications, contradictions, and conflicts, what are the implications for learning analytics? What are the implications when we collect, when we analyze, and when we use student data? So data always mattered. I was amazed, and I always amazed when I see an article to say that evidence-based management is sort of the new vogue word to include in our strategic documents. So data always mattered. The first censuses were used to determine taxes, to count citizens, and to define citizens, very important. So we not only counted citizens, we also first defined who counted as a citizen, and then we counted them. And we used censuses to also count the others, to allocate rights and privileges, and we use censuses to assess the number of arms-bearing men. Of course, women can't fight. So of the number of arms-bearing men in preparation for war. The first known census was in 300 before the Common Era. Then after the Common Era in the Han Dynasty, one of the earliest preserved censuses. And in the Bible, a number of censuses to determine taxes to count the number of foreigners living among Israelites. So throughout the ages, those who had the power decided on what data was needed, for what purposes, how the data was defined, what the data meant, who had access to the data, and who would verify the correctness and the meanings of the data. And we should not forget that the data equals power. And data has always been used to control, to solve or perpetuate societal problems, horrors. I think there's ample evidence of how it helps us to understand cancer and HIV and hunger and inequality. but it also perpetuated horrors and genocides. Data has always been used to allocate or withhold resources support. Uh, Data has always been used to safeguard the survival of those who collected the data and to ensure adherence to the assumed rules and conventions determined by those who collected the data. Examples, and I'm not going to spend time on this, is the panopticon of Jeremy Bentham and popularized in the work of Foucault, where through the structure of the environment, one could notice what people are doing. Then in 1749, there was the paper holder, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the French surname or the French title of this mechanism. It was proposed to King Louis in the 15th um, the 15th year, and then one of the first attempts to articulate a new technology based on power, on traces and archives, where this technology stored documents of individuals of every citizen in Paris. And in the report, it says it will allow the sovereign to know every inch of the city as well as his own house. He will know more about ordinary citizens than their own neighbors and the people who see them every day in their mass. Copies of their certificates will provide him with an absolute faithful image of the city. And I think in this image, I see the LMS, I see the learning management system, how we use that to control, to have a sense of who we can give access to and who we can award services to. The great Ivy League scandal of 1940 to 1970, where students' physical characteristics were used to determine access and potential. A person's body measured and analyzed could tell much about intelligence, moral worth, and probably future achievement. Does that not remind of our access requirements? That we use variables that are actually nonsensical. The data accumulated will eventually lead on to proposals to control and limit the production of inferior and useless organisms. Sounds like access requirements. So the collection, analysis, and use of data are political acts. Learning analytics per se is a political act and serves declared and hidden assumptions about the purpose of higher education and the masters it serves. Let's just revisit some of our beliefs about data and then we go on. Data do lie on occasion. They can lie for a whole bunch of reasons, for the simple to the complex. The lies can begin at point of collection and continue through aggregation and analysis. We don't often find this acknowledgement in an institutional report, do we? And this is again Todd Mather that says data are like Play-Doh and can take all sorts of shapes and dimensions. It can be worked and reworked for endless variety, but it can only stretch so far before it breaks and becomes separate pieces. This is what happens with data when you stretch the definition and structure too far. The original meaning is lost and provenance is both broken. Small pieces can be lost during the shaping and blended with other colors, creating something new, but increasingly more abstract than the original. So what student data do we currently have? Where is it stored? In what format? What is the quality of the data? Who has access to the data and what circumstances and for what purposes? We have student data from student registration or from prior to registration from their inquiries, whether it's telephonic, in person, by email, via social media. Currently, that data is stored on various places, if it's stored at all. We have data gathered during the registration process, the location of registration, demographics, socioeconomic data, prior learning, uploaded or not documents, financial status. We have LMS data, how long after registration did they log in, what resources did they download, how often, who did they interact with, if, for what purpose, what time of day, for how long, how many requests for password resets. That's an interesting one. What does it mean when we notice that the student is constantly requesting for a password reset? Does it say something about their ICT skills or short memory? We have data of academic support, their phone calls, their email, their visits to lecturers, tutors, but where is it recorded? We have data with regard to their request for administrative support, phone calls, emails, visits. We have data with regard to payments, assignment marks, examination dates, remarks. What does it say when a student is late with payment? What are our assumptions? What risk do we allocate to his or her learning when they've fallen behind on payments? There's affective support data, phone calls, emails, visit to support data, this support staff. Where does that data lie? We have class data, where there's attendance registers, clicker data. We have library data, physical or online. What resources were downloaded, access requested, how often? We have social media data increasingly. I'm not sure what we're going to do with it, but we have access. And then this is an interesting one. We have internal and external requests for student data. Who wanted to know what for what purpose, under what conditions ethical clearance required. So this is the data we currently have. My question is, where is this data stored? In what format? What is the quality of the data? Who has access to the data? Under what circumstances? For what purposes? And what happens when we combine these different data sources? And what happens when we combine different formats? And what happens when we clean databases? I shudder to think. So student data are currently used to determine access. What are assumptions based on the data? How sure are we that the data means what we think it means? What are the purposes of controlling access? Is it allocation of resources? Is it placements in programs? Do we want to protect the reputation of the institution? Is that why we gather their data? Allocation of resources, placements in programs, staff-student ratios, educational triage, that refers to that we classify students as in three groups as high risk, medium risk, and no risk, and that we allocate resources accordingly. And you can look at Sharon, my paper on that. We use student data increasingly to personalize curricular assessment, feedback, support, and short and extended programs. So what happens if we use race and gender and street address as a variable to determine whether they will be on a shortened or an extended program? We use it for marketing purposes, for reporting internal, external. We use it for curriculum redevelopment, for quality assurance. And this is an interesting one. We use student data to address strategic objectives. We can use student data to address the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, or we can use student data to dance to the drumbeat of the market. So let's look at way forward, and I'm wrapping up. Students' digital lives are, and our data sets are but a minute part of a bigger whole. So we should not pretend as if our data represent the whole. The data we collect are never raw, uncontaminated, or just scraped. Our samples, our choices, our timing of collection, our choice of tools change and impact on data. Remember that quote, that data is like Play-Doh. Data are in fact framed technically, economically, ethically, temporally, spatially, and philosophically. And data, and this is scary, data do not exist independently of the ideas, the instruments, the practices, the context, and knowledges used to generate, process, and analyze them. Data have context. To reuse data outside of the original context and purpose for which it was collected impacts on the contextual integrity. What I share on Facebook has a certain contextual integrity. If you use it to determine my potential for risk, we need to be scared. Knowing what is happening does not necessarily tell us the why. When we see education as an open recursive system, where multiple variables not only intersect but often also constitute one another. So let us tread carefully between correlation and causation, and this I find funny and lovely. There's a correlation between the amount of cheese you consume and the number of people who dies by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. So either change your bed sheets or cut down on your cheese consumption. The divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine. Maybe if things are not going well in your relationship, maybe cut down on your use of margarine. And yet we can laugh at this, but this is exactly what we do with student success and retention. We find things correlating. Students use Marmite and they fail. What the heck does it say? Some pointers. What are our management, administrative, faculty, and support staff beliefs about knowledge, about learning, assessment? What are our beliefs about data and evidence? What student data do we already have? Why was it collected? In which format is it stored? Who has access to the data? How is the data used by whom? How do students know about this? Do they have access to it? And do students know how it influences our and their choices? What data do students currently have access to about their learning, about their choices, and about our choices pertaining to their learning? What data don't students currently have access to, but that we have, that will help them to plan their time and resources in order to maximize their chances of success? What student data don't we have but need in order to teach better, allocate resources, and support students? Is this data available? Under what conditions will we be able to access it? How will we gather its storage, its combination with other sources of data? Who will have access to it and under what conditions? This was framed in 1973, and I'm wrapping up. There must be no personal date records keeping system whose very existence is secret. 1973, that's a long way before the LMS. There must be a way for an individual to find out what information about him, her is in the record and how it is used. It started in 1973. There must be a way for an individual to prevent information obtained about him, her, for one purpose for being used or made available for other purposes without his or her consent. So suddenly students submit an assignment and we publish research on their marks at a nice conference in France. They never knew it was going to be used for research purposes. There must be a way for an individual to correct or amend a record or of identifiable information about him, her. Any organization creating, maintaining, using, or disseminating records of identifiable personal data must ensure the reliability of the data for the intended use and must take reasonable precautions to prevent misuse. Sorry for the spelling mistake of the data. This is 1973. So what are the ethical implications? And this is based on Sharon, my work. There's a duty of reciprocal care. We must make our terms and conditions accessible and understandable, even if understandable means longer. We must make it clear what data is collected, when, for what purpose, for how long it will be kept, who will have access, and under what circumstances. We need to provide access to information and data held about our students to verify and question the conclusions drawn, and where necessary, provide context. We need to provide access to a neutral ombudsman for our students. We need to ensure the contextual integrity and lifespan of personal data. Context matters. Let's talk about student agency and privacy self-management. The fiduciary duty of higher education implies a social conflict of goodwill and do no harm. We can never underestimate the asymmetrical power relationship between institution and students, and it necessitates transparency, accountability, access, and input collaboration. We need to empower our students. We need to make sure what are the costs and benefits if they share data with us. And higher education should not accept a non-response as equal to opting in. Future direction and reflection, we need to rethink consent and employ nudges. We need to move away from a binary of opting in and opting out. There's a range of choices in specific contexts or needs. We need to develop partial privacy self-management based on context, need, value. We need to adjust privacy's timing and focus. What about downstream use of data, the importance of contextual integrity, the lifespan of data? We need to move towards substance over neutrality. We need to block troublesome and immoral practices, but also soft negotiated spaces of reciprocal care. I'm closing, colleagues. What are the ethical implications of knowing? What are the ethical implications of not knowing? What are the ethical implications of knowing what we don't know? knowing what we may never know. What are the ethical implications of knowing more? So the solution is not necessarily, I think, in knowing more, but ensuring that once we know, we respond and we have the ability to respond in ethical, caring, discipline, and context appropriate ways. What may be appropriate in accounting may not be appropriate in sociology or chemistry. I conclude technology is neither good or bad, nor is it neutral. Technology's interaction with social ecology is such that technical developments frequently have environmental, social, and human consequences that go far beyond the immediate purposes of the technical devices and practices themselves. This is 1986. Thank you very much. There's my detail if you need to comment or communicate. And I uploaded a number of very useful resources. This is very recent, published 2016, Indigenous Data Sovereignty, a wonderful report. Then there's the Some People Issue Ethics Code to Scientists, very useful pointers. Um, Sharon, my first article on ethics. Um, Sharon's work on applications of student data in higher education issues and ethical considerations, a wonderful publication. This is a wonderful paper by a colleague of mine in America, Structural Justice in Student Analytics, or The Silence of the Bunnies. I just love that title. 10 Simple Rules for Responsible Big Data Research. And if you look to these authors, to the names of the authors, these are some of the big names in the field of big data research. There's the report published by New America, The Promise and Peril of Predictive Analytics and Higher Education. The same, that one, Predictive Analytics in Higher Education, Manuel Okowa. Then a recent publication or presentation by Abelardo Pardo, The Role of Data and the Provision of Feedback at Scale. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was so insightful. We've had so many interesting comments and questions coming up in the text chat. I want to bring one to just to start. I think the first one, early on, you were speaking about because of the very broad definition and of learning analytics, and a lot of us see data differently, defining what qualifies as data. I saw Jerome talking about posts in a forum. You know, some of us are thinking very localized, and others are thinking much broad.
Thanks, Nicola. And I will invite Sharon as well to participate. The very interesting, the definition of learning analytics does not only refer to digital data, so it's much broader than LMS data. Secondly, the traditional definitions of learning analytics and academic analytics, they differentiate between academic analytics, where student data is used on an aggregate level to report to the institution and to external stakeholders, while learning analytics is on departmental and student level, which can be used to inform lecturers and tutors and students making more informed choices. So that's the differentiation. So it's not only LMS data. What happens now is that we combine LMS data, the number of logins, with demographic data like race or a street address. And then it becomes problematic because then we make two sets of assumptions about the logging data and assumptions about the street address. And when you combine these two, I'm just not sure we can use that as an indicator for the potential of the student. Possibly of risk, but the risk is not in the locus of control of the student. He or she cannot change their address. He or she may not have internet access. So what do we do with that risk? Should we define that student as at risk or being in a risk circumstance. So yeah, so that's the definition between learning analytics, academic analytics examples. And Sharon, please come in afterwards. There's dashboards provided by in the context of Purdue University, where there's a free lights, colored lights, red, yellow, and green, using algorithms and computer intelligence to measure students' number of logins, number of posts, number of engagements, and even quality of engagement. And then once the student logs onto the LMS, the light changes. So if he or she has logged on a lot this week and posted a lot, then the light may be green. But if they cannot access the LMS for in the following week, the light changes to yellow. My concern with that is, what if the circumstances surrounding the logging in less than the previous work is outside of the control of the student? And I would also like to engage with what are the
I
assumptions
see
about
Sharon
the
is
yellow,
typing, and she
the
said
green,
she'd
and the
feel more
red.
comfortable
Sharon, I wonder
typing
if you want to come in
response.
here.
Yes. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm just thinking
Okay, great. There she
localized
goes.
things
Thanks,
that
Nicola. I
people
hope
would
that was a
know
very big question, Nicola.
would be like
I hope
in
I addressed.
LMS, you can generate a report. One of the things might be on interaction in a forum or a quiz, and generally the lecturer has access to that report. Is that an example of learning analytics?
Great stuff. It's an example of learning analytics, but in if you have 20 students in your class and you see that three have not logged on this week, you may send a very personal email to them and say, "Hey, are you okay?" In the context of a mega distance education institution with 14,000 students, such a report may generate 10,000 students haven't logged on this week. So we need to think very carefully to say, okay, we need to contact them. We need to tell them that we are concerned. We carry their well-being on our hearts, and we are concerned about their engagement. So then an algorithm can actually formulate a very personalized email to say, we've seen you haven't logged on. Are you okay? If you're not okay on a personal level, please contact this department. If it's financial, please contact this department. If it's academic, please contact that department. Then again, in the second phase, we may actually have algorithmic sense making to say, of all the students we send the email to, their behavior has changed, and those whose behavior has not changed, let's send the second email to say, wow, we've sent you this email, we see you haven't changed your behavior. Are you okay? Can we call you? Or give them a toll-free number for them to call us. So I just think we need to say two things. What do we think they're not logging onto the LMS for a week means? There's a question there. And then secondly, we also need to think of how scalable is our interaction and our ability to respond. When you have 20 students, you can respond. When you have 14,000, it's almost impossible to respond in person. And we need to think carefully about our responsibility.
Thanks, Paul, and also thanks to Sharon.
When we notice
very
a trend.
insightful
And we
comments
need to
here.
ask
So it's
why.
also very contextual, is what you're saying. I know. I just want to move to some questions. I know time. We've got 5 minutes left, but Sakena asked an interesting question about whether there are is a potential relationship between learning analytics and the AI or algorithm-based learning. Could learning analytics use, and then also could learning analytics use make students passive? I think the one example you mentioned with the lights, that's
Yeah, there's a very interesting paper on. I've just uploaded it this morning on ResearchGate on algorithmic decision making in higher education, in which I explore two frameworks, and people are welcome to either send me an email and I can share the paper with them, or they can search for it on ResearchGate. The title of the article is "Fleeing from Frankenstein's Monster and Meeting Kafka on the Way." Yes, I know it's a laborious title, but I loved it. So in which I explore two models and two conceptual frameworks for using algorithmic decision making and the challenges and the ethical issues in that. So yes, so the light system of Purdue, the automated generation of emails, that's all examples of artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever tickles your fancy, whichever term you prefer. There's subtle differences between them, but let's talk about artificial intelligence. When we talk about scalability on
Yeah,
mass,
thank you. That's a lot of
we
deep
need to use
considerations there.
algorithmic decision
Khaled
making
also had an
and also deal
interesting
with the risk.
question. He asked how many students are currently participating in the conversation about whether and how their data should be analyzed. And then he says, well, if none, do we not recognize their right to be consulted about matters concerning their learning, over which they, he says, over which they alone should have agency? Question. He says, surely an ethics committee deciding is condescending and characteristic of coloniality. I know you've mentioned this topic quite a bit.
Great. Two questions then, two quick responses. Student engagement, do they know that we know and what we know and our assumptions about what we know and what we think we know? Khaled, you're absolutely right. How scalable that is on a mega distance education institution with 300,000 students. I don't know, but we need to involve them. The research Sharon has done in the Open University, where we've asked students, do you know we collect your data? And they were horrified. And then when we asked them, if we collect your data to make your learning experience better, are you okay with that? Some of them said yes, but I would like to have access. So Sharon may be able to share detail on that. The second thing is, what worries me about learning analytics is when we do research on students, we need to go through an ethical review process. We need to get informed consent. We need to go through all of that. Currently, learning analytics function outside of the ethical review boards. And I'm not here to suggest that it should. I'm not here to suggest that we should get ethical clearance for every interpretation of data or every sense making. But how do we deal? Who will hold us accountable? And there's an interesting research article that James Willis, Sharon, and myself wrote on what do we do with this thing that ethics does not fall under any jurisdiction.
Thank you.
At the moment.
That is, I think, Kane, who was Stefan's question, actually. He said, well, in some cases, it might be for the greater good to use data that's generated, but the data could also have a negative effect.
But at least the question is there that I think there will always be unintended consequences. And I think it's a French philosopher, and his name now slipped my mind, that says, yes, there will be unintended consequences, but this cannot prevent us, once we've taken a considerable number of steps to prevent unintended consequences, especially the negative ones. We cannot stop trying. And I think that is what Gerrit refers to. We have to explore, but in an ethical and
Thanks so much, Paul. I realize
it's
2 o'clock and we've probably got folks who need to leave to go to other meetings. We're all very probably sensitive to your times. And yeah, thanks so much for your presentation, Paul. If I could ask that folks continue the discussion via our Facebook event using the forum, that would be great. and we'll send out some more info in via email for those that have signed up via that notification. Any last words, Paul?
I think let's just take care of the ethics of using state as student data, but also
thank you very much,
explore
and
the
thanks
ethics of
all for
not
being a
using state
very
data. And thanks to you all.
very engaged group of attendees today. And we've had folks from all over: Nigeria, Mauritius, UK, Netherlands,